a deep dive into human rights and democracy issues across Europe. This is the Speechbag podcast by Liberties. I'm Jonathan Day. On this episode, the European Union has helped nurture and strengthen democracy across Europe. And while it certainly has its detractors, the EU project stands as a beacon of cooperation, compromise, and participatory democracy. But, ironically, the process of EU lawmaking, especially at perhaps its most crucial stage, is shut off from the public and non-transparent. In nondescript rooms of EU buildings, secret meetings, known as the trilogues, are held for EU legislators to bargain and agree on the final texts of EU laws. The public is kept in the dark, even about the most basic details, and even long after these meetings are wrapped and the laws have been agreed. European Ombudsman Emily O'Reilly has been Europe's top guardian of accountability and transparency since being elected to the post in 2013. She's made transparency, especially during the trilogue process, an important focus of her work. Ombudsman O'Reilly, the trilogues are labeled informal meetings, and yet at the same time, they're a crucial stage of EU lawmaking. But it's also fair to say that it's not well understood by the general public. Even the name trilogue has this sort of Brussels speak vibe to it.
Well, I remember when I came here in 2013 and I was running for elections, the parliament that elects the ombudsman. And it was the first time I'd heard the word trilogue used. I'd meet MEPs and they said, I'm going to a trilogue. I'm just back from a trilogue. I was up until 3 o'clock in the morning with the trilogue, and I'd be sort of nodding as if I think I'm supposed to know what this is. So,
So the trilogue stage of EU lawmaking is one that you once called the horse trading phase, when all the hard bargaining happens, although perhaps secret horse trading phase is more accurate. But broadly speaking, what happens during the trilogues, and what has been the crux of the transparency deficit?
It is the horse trading, and it's the horse trading between the Commission, which has proposed a piece of legislation, and then the two institutions that legislate together, as the Parliament and the Council. So the Commission puts in a proposal, and then the Council and the Parliament have their positions, and then the three get together and try and reach a consensus about it. And people like to be involved in trilogues because you're not there with another several hundred MEPs. You're there, you're quite special, or you're representing the Council or the Commission or whatever it is. So it's almost like it's quite an elite grouping as well. So it's kind of interesting to be in it. And then when we started kind of getting complaints about trilogue transparency, or just hearing about it generally, we saw, when are the trilogues taking place? No idea. What trilogues are taking place at the moment? No idea. Who's involved in the trilogues? No idea. Where can we get information about trilogues? Very hard.
The EU Commission, the Parliament, and the Council all meet behind closed doors to hash out any disagreements and find common ground on a final version of a law that all parties support. Originally, the meetings were so secret and mysterious that it was unclear when they were even happening or what, even broadly, was being discussed. There have been small improvements to make the process more open, but these meetings are still cloaked in secrecy. And the defense of this secrecy is that this is the way to get quick results.
It's a remarkably efficient process. About 80% of the laws that eventually affect all of us in the EU, are enacted by way of trilogues. So it's much easier, fewer people, more efficient, and so on. But the problem is that there is seen to be a trade-off between the efficiency of the process and the accountability of the process, because if there is agreement at trilogue stage, that tends to be it. Okay, there has to be the formal agreement at council level. It goes into the plenary at Parliament, but rarely does it change. But it's very hard to know what's actually going on there. So if I make an analogy with what happens in a member state and in your country or my country, in general, we know what's going on. We know what position the government is taking. We know what position the opposition parties are taking. We know, generally speaking, if there's lobbying, because we'll hear debates on radio, television, we'll see it on our social media, all of that. So we're generally in the know. But as you say, Brussels is over there. And it's difficult, it's complex for everybody. We all pretend we know exactly how it works, but even in Brussels sometimes we're a bit confused, and the language can be difficult. So in Brussels, if you're looking at it from the member states, it's very hard to know how decision making is made. And if everybody goes into the little bubble of the trilogues, it's even more difficult. Because if let's say you were to go online now and you were to try and find what trilogues are happening, who's taking part, can I find out what documents are being sent into them, what the conversations are about, you would find it extremely difficult, because there's no central place where you can find all this information. And so therefore, when it comes out, it's already cooked, if you like.
Mm-hmm. So secret meetings, lack of transparency and accountability, these things sound on their face to be bad, even perhaps undemocratic things. But on the other hand, it is, as you say, very efficient. And your average EU citizen might, to put it plainly, not really notice the difference. So aside from the secret or shady or any other unseemly adjectives we can attach, how does this lack of transparency distort the democratic process and impact the rights and freedoms of EU citizens?
Well, I suppose in a broad sense, you could say that decisions are being made without their input, So as I said, if you go back to the member states analogy, if there is some sensitive piece of legislation that is going to be passed in Germany or Ireland or wherever, people will know about it and they will find ways of making their views felt. So that when something comes out, eventually they hope that it will be broadly reflect the views of the citizens in that country. Whereas in trilogue, all of these things are being done. And also, even knowing the positions of your own member state in relation to a particular piece of legislation is also difficult, because horse trading goes on obviously at trilogue level, but it also goes on within the council. That's where all of our relevant ministers go and trash out the laws. But if you were, let's say, a law is being formulated today in relation to, the protection of bees, then okay, what position is this country taking or that country taking, and it can be hard to find out, and because what happens as well is that with council members themselves do deals. So Ireland might say to Germany, well, you support me on the bees and I'll support you on tobacco. And while the people in Ireland might like the bee stuff, they might not like the tobacco stuff. So, now the council will say that, and also people who favour the trilogues as they currently stand will say that, well, look, nothing's going to get done if everybody's going to pile in and have their views known, and it'll be, it'll be like the Tower of Babel. But on the other hand, you have to find that balance between, having space for the deliberative process, and yet allowing the citizens' voices to come in. And of course, it also, that sort of opacity allows our ministers or prime ministers or chancellors, whatever, to go back to their people. And if the people end up not liking a particular EU regulation, say, well, we're sorry, but that's Brussels, as if they had nothing to do with it. I mean, if you take the vaccine contracts, which were quite controversial for a period, as you know, everybody talked about the Commission and the vaccine contracts. But in fact, the vaccine contracts were agreed. Well, there was a group of 7 member states who were part of the committee, and their names were not released for a long time. It was incredible. We couldn't even know what countries were on that thing. But so the member states have a role. But when it's all done under the umbrella of the Brussels bubble, then people feel there's some weird, strange entity in Brussels that does all this. When, in fact, as I often say, Brussels isn't Brussels. Brussels is, it's Berlin and Dublin and Bratislava and Stockholm and all of that. That's Brussels.
This is something you've acknowledged before, that yes, there is some level of discretion needed to get laws passed, but only up to a point. How do we draw that line?
Well, you can't do it mathematically, obviously. But I think that sometimes EU institutions are very conservative and even alarmist in relation to the damage that they perceive would be done if certain information was put into the public domain. And you're right, it is a balance. But when you talk about and every good Freedom of Information Act, including 1049 regulation, which governs EU access to documents, they do have exemptions, and one of the exemptions is for the deliberative process. Okay, but how long does the deliberative process go on? For example, just talking about the bees there, and this is a case I talk about a lot, but we got a case recently it was a French organization called Paulinus, and it was in relation to advice that the Commission had given in relation to the use of certain pesticides and their impact on the bee population. I think we're all becoming increasingly sensitized to that as an important environmental issue.
The French environmental NGO Paulinus made a request for access to documents detailing the positions of member states in a committee dealing with assessing the risks pesticides pose to bees. The Commission refused access to the documents, arguing that its rules prevented it from disclosing the positions of individual member states, and that making such information public would prevent member states from frankly expressing their views. It's a very similar excuse made to support the secrecy of the trilogues. Ombudsman O'Reilly looked at the bees case, as it's become known, and found the Commission was wrong to refuse access to the documents. In her view, the documents should be publicly accessible as legislative documents, and she asked the Commission to release them. The Commission refused, a decision Ombudsman O'Reilly has called maladministration.
The view was, from the institution, that there was a greater public interest in protecting the deliberative process than in allowing people to know very important information about what position member states were taking in relation to this issue, which now we know very directly impacts us. And this would be fine if it was 6 months deliberative process or even a year, but I think it's now probably 8 years since that piece of advice went in. And you see, when it isn't visible, then people can hide. We don't like this, or this country is tricky about this or that, so look, let's just leave it. And nobody will know because we won't release the documents. So, sometimes when we talk about these words, trilogues and transparency and trust and all that, they seem very abstract. But when you actually see the concrete reality and impact of them, then it's much more important. And in trilogues as well, obviously, and very often, the proposal by the Commission is changed. Obviously, that's the whole point of negotiation discussion. But, changed in which way, and if certain things are watered down, such as what happened in relation to the Parliament legislative proposals in relation to the climate change package just this week, you're wondering, well, how did that happen? So are people influencing to enhance in the public interest? Are they seeking to influence to speak more to the interests of a particular business or industrial sector?
And this is where the lack of transparency in the EU lawmaking process, and in particular the trilogues, takes perhaps its darkest turn. While EU citizens, journalists, and citizens groups are shut out of the trilogue process, lobbyists are not. The veritable armies of well-heeled lobbyists that work on behalf of corporations are able to access EU legislators at the most crucial stage of the deliberative process. Their presence in and around the EU's halls of power has grown substantially in recent years.
I think lobbying has become a much more significant in Brussels. I mean, I haven't been here that long, I've been here 10 years, but in the last few decades, the EU has developed even more into a big global regulator, because when you regulate for Europe, you're effectively regulating for the world. So, I mean, you see the big dramas being played out between Europe and the tech companies, for example, as the Europe or the EU attempt to sort of rein in their power, their influence, their dominance in all sorts of ways. And then you see it obviously in pharmaceutical companies, which are obviously a big deal at the moment in the pandemic. And you see it in all sorts of, you see it particularly now with oil, gas. On the one hand, you have the whole climate change and environmental agenda. Of course, the Ukraine and Russia's invasion of Ukraine has beginning to influence that. So a lot of the work that I do, whether it's on lobbying transparency, whether it's on the transparency of the decision making, whether it's on, the balance of voices that the Commission hears when it's making legislation, it's all about who influences, who ultimately is influencing, who are the big voices when a piece of legislation goes through.
The EU has made some steps to bring greater lobbying transparency, creating the Transparency Register. It's a database that lists the entities that try to influence the EU lawmaking process. The register shows what interests are being pursued, by whom, and with what budgets. But even this good step is, in critical ways, deficient.
In the last few years, if somebody is going, let's say you're a commissioner or you're the sec-gen of a DG or you're in the commissioner's cabinet, if somebody is going to lobby you, then they have to say, so-and-so met with Commissioner X today in order to talk about Y. But what's missing, sometimes the details the entries are made quite late. But also what happens is that it doesn't give you a lot of information. So if you're, let's say, Mr. X from Google, well, let's say Google came to visit. Well, you don't know whether that's, the receptionist or whether it's, somebody who's very senior in the organization. And then when they say what the conversation was about, they might say, well, the future of Europe. Yeah, when actually it's about a tiny little amendment on a proposed piece of regulation. So, and also there's and there are many ways of lobbying. There are all sorts of various groups and fora set up ostensibly to promote some public interest, but actually they're backed by particular private industrial interests and so on. So it's tricky, but they are hugely influential. Now, I don't know the extent to which the lobbying led to the changed positions that we saw this week in the climate change, the Fit for 55 legislation, but I suspect probably it did.
Earlier this month, it appears that a barrage of 11th hour lobbying by energy corporations derailed a key vote in the European Parliament on legislation that would move the EU to cut emissions. MEPs of the centre-right European People's Party bowed to corporate lobbying efforts and flipped to join other conservative factions in backing a slew of industry-friendly amendments to the text. The amendments were too extreme for the centre and centre-left parties to accept, and the text was sent back to the drawing board. Ombudsman O'Reilly says the presence of lobbyists that week was unmissable.
I noticed, because I live in Strasbourg and I was in the Parliament on Monday or Tuesday, and at one point I was sitting in one of the cafes and I was looking around. I was saying, who are all these people? Because there weren't MEPs and there weren't MEPs' assistants, or and a lot of them were lobbyists, and they were there.
Of course, this was happening even before the trilogue phase, but we know that lobbying can be just as intense, if not more so, during the trilogues. And here is one of the central imbalances. Lobbyists can know so much more about the process, every stage of it, and have access to all the details, while EU citizens know almost nothing.
While you might not know as an ordinary citizen, or I might not know as an ordinary citizen, even if I am the European Ombudsman, the people who are paid to know and find out are the lobbyists, those people who are paid by companies and often very big global companies to influence the making of the legislation. That's their job, and they're paid to do it. So they, because they're clever people and generally well networked, will know far more than you or I will know what's going on in a particular trilogue. So they can say, okay, we hear that the council position is this, so let's talk to the perm rep from this country, that country, that country. This politician is proving to be very influential in relation to this particular amendment. Let's try and influence them, and on it goes. So there is a disparity between the capacity of the ordinary people, the citizens for whom all this has been done on behalf of, and then the influential lobbyists.
The collapse of the aforementioned Fit for 55 climate legislation underscores the effectiveness of lobbyists on EU legislators. Max Bonk is a researcher and campaigner at Lobby Control, a German organization that works to raise awareness about the extensive role lobbyists play in manipulating the lawmaking process, both in Germany and at the EU level. He says lobbying efforts have grown exponentially in recent years, so much so that Brussels is now among the world's top arenas for lobbying.
If you talk about capitals of lobbying in the world, you would say Washington is capital number one. So in DC, you really have armies of lobbyists trying to influence policymaking. Brussels would be number 2 already. A lot of lobbying is taking place there. According to recent numbers of Transparency International EU, more than 36,000 lobbyists doing their job every day in Brussels.
36,000 lobbyists in Brussels alone. That sounds like quite a lot.
That's quite a lot. The number has been increasing in the last 10 years, I would say, and the professionalization has taken place as well. There are even degrees nowadays in Europe to learn how to lobby, right? And there's been a change with respect to lobbying as well, and a degree of unprecedented professionalization.
And this professionalization, these 36,000 lobbyists, they're extremely well-resourced. I believe a report your organization produced says something like 97 million euros is spent on lobbying efforts in Brussels every year.
That's the correct figure, 97 million euros of lobby spending. At the same time, we only compared the top 10 companies, right? So, and there we could see that really the car industry is spending only 1/3 of the what big tech is spending in the EU.
In fact, big tech has become the biggest spender on lobbying in the EU, and it has a lot to do with a raft of legislation the EU has been working on. Legislation that would rein in the extensive and often abusive power of big tech companies. The two most notable are the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act, which have now made it nearly all the way through the legislative process, ending earlier this year with the trilogues. At the beginning of July, they will be voted on and then become law. Max Bonk says these pieces of legislation offer a good case study on how lobbying affects each stage of the legislative process, right through the trilogues, and how it can have dramatic consequences.
The first phase of lobbying is already very essential, actually. It's before the Commission comes up with its first draft. And the first draft for the Digital Market Act and came in September 2020, December 2020, I think on the 9th of December, as far as I remember. And before that, you already have a lot of lobbying going on, because we think, and we are convinced that the phase when a piece of legislation is framed is before the first draft is actually published. So you had consultations, official consultations, but you had a lot of lobbying ongoing already before. And you could see that very well, because ahead of the publication of the first Commission draft of the DMA, a Google lobby strategy was leaked. And it showed entirely that lobbying had started half a year before, right? To weaken the draft already and to make sure Google's interests are taken into account.
Even before a proposal has had a solid review and understanding by all legislative bodies, lobbyists are trying to set the course of debate and negotiations.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So this first phase, it frames in a certain sense also the debate about the legislation, right? Very important. And one thing that struck us, and we still don't have an answer to, is that at the beginning of the DMA, there was supposed to be a new competition tool to break up companies. It was supposed to be in the DMA, and it was out in the end. And we are still wondering why, and we still don't have an answer. The Commission claims that it's due to legal reasons, as the legal basis of the DMA is not competition policy, but internal market. But we are still not sure, and we can't really say, because some MEPs still have this question. Also, member states are, like Germany, for instance, the German government is still wondering why it was out in the end.
So even members of the European Parliament and member state governments aren't getting a straight answer from the Commission on what happened to this missing competition tool, or an understanding of to what degree lobbying was behind killing that component.
Yeah, this is, for instance, a very interesting case to see. We are still trying to find out if lobbying took place around this issue of the new competition tool.
So walk us through the next steps of the process, because it's not only at the beginning and the end or the trilogues when lobbyists really earn their keep, right?
Stage 2 is discussions in Parliament, in Council, and filing their positions. And then they come back, and that's, of course, an important phase of lobbying towards the Parliament and towards member states. But I would say, for instance, civil society focuses very much on the Brussels bubble and on the Parliament, whereas those who have more financial resources can also lobby and tackle member states' governments, which is of course a big advantage. And after this second phase, you have the so-called trilogues, where Council, Parliament, Commission come together and negotiate a compromise. That's probably the most intransparent phase of the negotiations, even though it's super important, because there all institutions normally have to make compromises. Some parts of the legislation can still drop out, right?
Right. I think this is the really alarming part. It's not just that there's corporate lobbying going on at the trilogues when the voices of citizens are shut out, but that it's often extremely effective and seemingly out of nowhere with no accountability, laws just change.
In the case of the Digital Markets Act that I mostly followed, you could clearly see that in phase 2, the European Parliament developed a very strong position on the DMA, a very progressive one that was, with respect to the draft, more ambitious, clearly more ambitious than the Commission draft. And Council at the same time developed its position, which was not that strong, also normal. Also because you have some member states hosting some of the big tech companies in Europe that try to weaken the position, and not a clear majority of member states defending very strongly big tech regulation. And then you have these trilogues, which becomes somehow totally intransparent. You can follow Parliament's discussion. You can even watch the committee meetings live.
Would it be fair to say then, in the case of DMA especially, that lobbyists were more successful lobbying member states, or put focus there, knowing that if they can weaken one leg, the others will be forced to compromise?
If you ask me, where we have lack of transparency in the EU legislation, it's to a large degree the Council. What surprised us actually is the degree to which MEPs resisted lobby pressure in the discussions around the Digital Markets Act. Even in the opaque phase of the trilogues, they really made clear that they want to regulate big tech, they want to limit the power of big tech, and insisted on their positions. And that's quite something, despite the massive lobby pressure coming from the digital industry.
According to Max Bank, the issue is not simply that the Council is opposed to transparency, but also that it actually pressured other legislators, specifically the Parliament, to also resist efforts to bring more transparency to the DMA negotiations.
I think there was a lot of pressure on the other EU institutions, especially the Parliament, not to disclose the negotiating documents of the trilogue. I guess that was one of the reasons why they were not disclosed.
The Council, or the representatives of the member states, is cited also by Ombudsman O'Reilly as the most prominent obstacle to greater transparency. And that opposition to more transparency exists most strongly from the most powerful member states.
I mean, at member state level, we find that, there is a group of countries who are advocating for greater transparency at council level and trilogue level, but generally they'd be the Nordics, Ireland as well, be among them. But the two big member states, Germany particularly, and France more in particular, are just not big into that transparency piece when it comes to that. And that's important because, as you know, they are and continue to be the two big players at council level. And Germany did make some moves when it held the presidency. France, I'm just trying to think, not so much, but it was interesting because President Macron was over in Strasbourg a few weeks ago at the concluding plenary of the Conference on the Future of Europe. And, citizens were at the heart of the conference, as you know. And yet, there's that, and of course he spoke, as he always does, very well about that, and involving citizens and embedding, strengthening democracy and all that stuff. But I mean, transparency and accountability has to be a part of that. They go hand in hand.
What needs to change then in order to bring greater transparency to the trilogue process? When you started looking at this issue years ago, we were in an even worse place from a transparency perspective, but what still needs to change?
So when we did the piece on the trilogues a few years ago, we asked for very basic things, that there would be a sort of a central base where all this information is. But we were looking for something a bit more ambitious, a central transparency hub where you would have a lot of the issues that we've been discussing for the last while, a sort of central repository of that in relation to lobbying and all of that, conflicts of interest. And we asked that, people would know when they're happening and agendas and all of that. So those small changes have taken place. But in terms of the bigger piece, in terms of, the people seeing the positions that as they emerge or more documents being released, in relation to it, that's slower. So while we have the technicalities, it's harder to get the substantive piece, the sort of stuff that lobbyists certainly look for.
Max Bonk agrees that access to the negotiating documents, the substantive documents that even lobbyists could put their hands on, is a necessary step. And one, he says, that should have happened a long time ago.
I mean, first of all, let me say that according to the law, the trilogues should be transparent. So every citizen of the EU has the right to access key negotiating documents. And the most important one is the so-called 4-column document, where each institution has one column where it states its position. And at the end, the fourth one is the compromise. That's the one that is filled during the trilogues. And normally, you should have access to these documents. There's a judgment actually by the European Court of Justice, the so-called Capitani judgment, and it states clearly that the EU institutions should disclose these documents to enable citizens to follow the political process. But what happens indeed, and we experience this with the Digital Markets Act, they don't disclose the documents. They don't disclose the documents timely, and there's a lot of delay. You get documents that are relevant in January 2022. Yeah, in this case, you get these documents in February or March. And of course, the negotiation process is much further then, and changes have taken place. If you want to enable people to follow a political process, this is not the way to do it. The public has a right to know what's going on there between the EU institutions, as these regulations coming from the EU side are so important for the future of our society. Disclosing the 4CT documents on a regular basis during the negotiation process is totally acceptable and needed, actually.
The EU's so-called revolving door is another area where both Ombudsman O'Reilly and Max Bonk see room for improvements in transparency and lobbying.
Officials from the Commission, which is the main regulatory body, obviously, move out of the Commission and go into the private sector.
EU officials move from roles as legislators and regulators to positions in the industries affected by the legislation and regulations. Prized for their knowledge and connections inside the political bodies, such movement can create conflicts of interest or the loss of confidence in the regulating institutions.
The problem there is that the Commission is very reluctant to stop anybody from going. So normally they put restrictions on them. So they say, well, you can go, but you can't, for a period of so many years, lobby your former network. You can't do this, you can't do that. And so they all say, yes, we promise faithfully we won't do that. But then look at the other side of the coin. And some of your listeners, I challenge them, invite them to do that. Go onto the websites of the big consultancy firms, the big law firms in Brussels, and take a look. And you will see how they showcase the fact, and this is branding, this is marketing to get clients in. Look who we have got from DG Trade. Look who we have got from DG Competition. Look who we have got from this. And that's lobbying, because on the one hand, and I was saying this at an event in Paris yesterday about transparency and ethics and so on, you have the Commission saying, no, this is absolutely fine. We've made sure they're not going to lobby their former network, give any inside information away, do this, do that. And then you have to think, well, what the heck do they want them for? If not that, I mean, what is their use, So, as I was saying at the event yesterday, we really have to bridge that gap between fantasy land, that none of this is going to happen, and the reality, which is, as you see on the websites of many of these companies, the fact that these people are here and they're going to give you the inside track, and why else would they hire them?
Ultimately, whether the Council, Parliament, and Commission want to acknowledge it or not, bringing more transparency to the trilogue process will only help the EU in the long run. Refusing to release trilogue documents and make the process more transparent ultimately undermines their own work.
If citizens believe that information, documents, whatever, is being kept from them, and things are being done in little Brussels bubbles, that generates distrust, suspicion, and it also feeds into a sort of an anti-EU, a hostile Eurosceptic sort of mindset, which is very useful to certain regimes, both within and without the member states. So what I say to the EU, that it is in their interest to be as transparent as possible and as open as possible, because if they are not, it will be used against them in a way that is damaging to the EU and therefore damaging to all of the citizens within the EU.
That's it for the Speechbag podcast by Liberties. If you have questions or comments, drop us a line at podcast@liberties.eu. This has been a presentation of the Civil Liberties Union for Europe.